Hello, lords and ladies of the internet. I'm the King of Candor, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of hobgoblins in fantasy. So, this one's going to be a little bit more complicated than normal. Hobgoblins are not really popular in modern fantasy, outside of Dungeons & Dragons and its own derivations. I actually think this is a bit of a tragedy, and to make up for it, I'm going to talk about at the end of my video some of the cool things that you could do with them in your setting, and how they exist in my setting. But first, the history. Hobgoblins. What are they? Why are they different from goblins? Where did they come from? Historically, goblins, gnomes, sprites, fairies, hobgoblins, brownies, pixies, and kobolds are all basically the same thing. By the way, there's like 95 other things you can call them, so this is not a complete list of the funny little words for these funny little guys. To keep it simple, you would categorize this creature as a house sprite. They were sometimes beneficial, sometimes malevolent creatures that would live in your house back in the day. This would explain odd little occurrences, such as finding $20 in your pants, or why the left sock is always the one missing. Almost all these creatures exist in small, geographic locations, where that is the term for this type of thing. Think about how different parts of America refer to a carbonated sugar beverage. Some call them sodas, some call them pops, some call them sody pops, and some call them cokes, who are absolute madmen and need to be stopped immediately, and so on. So, when looking at hobgoblins specifically, it always seems like they're more of a trickster spirit. I want to specifically call out a sprite known as a brownie as well. These guys are kind of like little Harry and they're shy little guys. They don't come out very often, but when they do, they will do stuff around the house, like your chores, in return for small rewards. Sometimes that's coins, sometimes it's food. Usually, though, it's a bowl of milk or cream, which I'm going to get back to. These brownies are also not very fond of being made fun of or insulted, and if you do insult them, they will leave or turn into a hobgoblin. So, what's the difference? In old mythology and folklore, it's very difficult to tell if it's two entirely different creatures or one creature with two forms. I'm going to say it's a little bit of both for now, and you'll see why. Because seeing hobgoblins as brownies and them tied together makes a lot more sense in these early stories, and these are the ones where you get a farmer needing some help, and a little hobgoblin guy comes along, or brownie, and they show up and do some work. So, what do they actually look like? I know I said they were hairy, but the best way to think of them right now is the Keebler elves, but hairier. I think I'm underselling just how important the hair is, by the way. That's basically all the descriptions throughout this time period. Small, little guys, hairy. That's it. What's weird, though, is they kind of just look like normal humans, and they stay linked together to these brownies until about the 1600s, where you see an actual split in the folklore. A lot of hobgoblins become much more mischievous and cruel to begin with, whereas brownies stay as these sort of nice, happy guys. But before we talk about the split to hobgoblins, I want to wrap up the brownies, because they're really important for some reason. They always sort of struck me as like inside your house garden gnomes, and they were eventually turned into a series of pictures and postcards in the 1880s. These things were incredibly popular and blew up across America, causing what became known as Brownie Mania in the 1890s. Palmer Cox, the writer of the postcard and several stories involving these new brownies, ended up being one of the first people to ever license out something. These little guys were on cigars, coffee pots, magazines, everything you could think of. After this, they sort of became forgotten during this craze, and brownies are only really around in a couple fantasy novels these days, such as the Spiderwick Chronicles. The biggest thing I actually see them revived in is Willow, where they're given a bit more of a warriorish aspect, which is very strange that Willow showed up here. So, for all my foodies out there, yes, I do think that the brownie spirit is related to the brownie cake. The rumor has it that the brownie cake was invented in 1893 by Bertha Palmer when she requested the master chef make thinner cakes so that she could eat with her friends. The recipe wasn't given a real name until 1896, but, like I mentioned, brownie mania was in full swing, so I 100% believe the two are linked. I do want to help emphasize just how big brownie mania was. Think about Star Wars right before Disney bought it. It was absolutely everywhere. I mean, there were oranges with Star Wars characters on them. That's how these brownies were. The last bastion of brownies was actually the Cleveland Browns football team. Yeah, I know. I'm just as shocked as you are, but that's where they get their name from. This guy here, he's named Brownie, who was the mascot for these guys and named after our little garden gnome friends. Which means there's a universe where we have the Cleveland Hobgoblins instead of the Cleveland Browns. Just food for thought. There's one more small tidbit I wanted to talk about, and I'm not really sure where to put it in the video, so we're going to put it here. The house elves from Harry Potter are also basically brownies for all intents and purposes. Like I mentioned earlier, there are several names for hobgoblin-like creatures, including the brownie. But if you go to Lancashire and Yorkshire, you will find the hobby, or as is also called, the dobby. If the dobby becomes too much of a prankster, though, he becomes known as a boggart. So yeah, that's another creature J.K. Rowling took from local mythology. Helpful dobbies, though, are apparently common enough that if you were incredibly productive one day, someone could remark, "Oh, it seems Master Dobbs has been helping you." So I guess instead of calling them house elves, we could also call them hobgoblins or brownies. So before we get back to hobgoblins, if you like the content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. If you want to keep up with things going on behind the scenes, there's a link to my Discord below, as well as I do weekly live streams here. Come by and ask any fantasy questions in chat. So, hobgoblins. As the brownies became much more friendly and mainstream, like I mentioned, the hobgoblins became twisted and crueler. They would still be often used as labor, but when scorned, they would get quick, dirty revenge. The 1600s, by the way, there's a really strange resurgence of hobgoblin literature and stories. There's a couple dozen surviving works that talk about them and reference them, which makes me wonder, why were they brought back into the zeitgeist at the time? I can't find any major references to why, but these hobgoblins are interesting for our story. As noted, they're very hairy and love milk and are really strong. In fact, they would just basically work as slave labor for a bowl of milk or cream. Interestingly, in La Allegro by John Milton, which is a poem, we see one of these creatures called Lubber Fiend, which is a fantastic name for a bad guy, by the way. He helps clean up and set a picnic table and does the dishes for a group of lovers in the story, which is nice as he's acting a bit like a maid. However, after this brief shining light here, hobgoblins are brought back down to the sneaky little chaos being category. At least for now. They kind of fade away again into the 1800s. From here, they chip along, just showing up in stories and background things, until we get to the most famous reference to hobgoblins, in the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. In his essay, Self-Reliance, he talks about them as such. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblins of little minds. Here, he talks about the man's imagined problems as those little nagging things in the back of your mind that don't really matter. That's his image of a hobgoblin. This is probably one that most normal people know for its quote, and it's really helpful for understanding the design of the creature. It's this small, nagging, biting little thing. And now we are entering the era of modern fantasy. From here, we see that hobgoblins are in D&D, and this is where they're linked to the regular goblins and bugbears. Hobgoblins sort of become the boss mechanically, being lesser than orcs but bigger than goblins, which does shift throughout the editions, but at first this is how it was. They also have a leathery skin and are braver than goblins. Gary and Dave did this just because they were going through different mythological creatures and wanted to give them stats, and these are the first to set up goblins smaller than hobgoblins, even though historically hobgoblins were smaller. Or is that true? You see, this is typically where the research goes on these guys. I've read 100 different articles where everybody says Gary and Dave screwed up and they're the ones who invented the smaller goblins, bigger hobgoblins. But there's something else I want to hear. I'm going to open them here to the preface of The Hobbit. Tolkien writes, "Orc is not an English word. It occurs in one or two places in The Hobbit, but is usually translated as goblin or hobgoblin for the larger kinds." You catch that? Tolkien himself says hobgoblins are larger kinds of goblins, and they're always linked to orcs. Tolkien is the one to do this. Hobgoblins are always more chaotic, smaller, and crueler than goblins in other works, but here, Tolkien is the first one to go against convention, and he goes against it right before Gary and Dave do so. Why is this important, by the way? Because for decades after the release of the first edition, Gary and Dave, to a lesser extent, denied Tolkien's influence of the game as much as they could. They're trying to say it was small. We can clearly see it was not small because this random throwaway line in the opening of The Hobbit was turned into a full creature. I'm going to give them credit though. Gary and Dave probably said it was small due to all the lawsuits that the Tolkien estate hit them with, which is just complete BS in my opinion, and that's a subject for another day. So, let's go back to Dungeons & Dragons and talk about the creature that they made. The hobgoblin that was originally for Dungeons & Dragons is a bit of a wild one. While I mentioned before, they're more trickster spirit with slight maliciousness. Here, they're straight up monsters. In the same vein as the traditional fantasy goblin and orc, they are brutal raiders who kill and eat everybody. A few interesting things though in this first version. They actually have a higher morale than goblins, as well as being a bit taller and a bit tougher than them. Like I said, making slightly weaker orcs. Otherwise, they're not really unique at all. This is how they are in the original white box set, which eventually became first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. During this, I found something interesting. They became bonded with a creature called the carnivorous apes. Gary has to be obsessed with these things because they keep showing up in these books, and around this time, we also get the Isle of the Ape module. That's the video linked here that I did about it, which is the Fantasy King Kong book if you ever wanted to watch that video. I'll also link it below for afterwards. But yeah, carnivorous apes. They even speak the language of them, the hobgoblins do, and the carnivorous ape is the favorite animal of the hobgoblin god, who was killed off in later editions for Magoubliette. By 1977, with the release of the Monster Manual and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, we get some good descriptions of regular hobgoblins. I want to read their exact description real quick. The hairy hides of hobgoblins range from dark reddish-brown to gray-black. Their faces are a bright red to orange red. Large males will have blue and red noses. Eyes are either yellowish or dark brown. Teeth are yellowed, white to dirty yellow. This is a substantial move away from the basic goblin kind, and if you look at the art, you also see that they're wearing samurai armor. This part of my research took the longest for me to try to understand and figure out, because unfortunately nobody asked the designers before they all died where this came from. Why did they get the hobgoblins in chains like this? Now, I don't have any direct proof or quotes. However, based on what books I know they had access to, as well as which monsters are not in the Monster Manual, I think I found the origins for these hobgoblins. I think they are basically Japanese Tengu. Now, I know a lot of people are confused right now because you're picturing the bird people for Tengu or Kenku. However, that's not actually the most common in the classic version of the species. Originally, they were more like hairy men with red faces and long noses, often associated with monkeys in the hot springs. This connection goes so deep, actually, that the original Tengu is Sarahitato Okami. I totally butchered that, I'm sorry, by the way, who's a Shinto monkey god. So why would they not just add Tengu, but instead mix them with hobgoblins? I have a few theories. First, there are several mythological sources that describe Tengu as Japanese goblins, as well as, other than the ability to fly, a lot of their bird-like features are way toned down in older versions of the myth. This bird aspect, though, really gets doubled down in Dungeons & Dragons after they reintegrate the creature into fantasy and try to make it have a more distinct aspect. So, thinking about that, this is why the hobgoblins would be in samurai armor. This is why they're friends with monkeys and apes. This is why they act the way they do. This is supposed to be a more interesting take on the goblins that they were stuck with. They took the creature of hobgoblin they already wrote about and already gave into the original rules and made it have fresh life. So this means that a more correct version of a hobgoblin would actually be a monkey man. Now, side tangent, there's also a subspecies called the Coanlith, who are aquatic hobgoblins that were introduced before 1st edition along with regular hobgoblins. So why haven't I mentioned them yet? They just kind of suck, in my opinion. Their entire description is just aquatic hobgoblins, which is lame. They don't really change from just being aquatic hobgoblins and are dropped for most of the game's history, with them only showing up in 5th edition on accident, because when they ported over the Ghost of Saltmarsh adventure path from 1st edition, they didn't change the creature here. Otherwise, they would have just stayed in 1st and 2nd edition forever. Something I find interesting, though, is here we start to see the development of the hobgoblin culture. They absolutely hate elves and love war, which is a holdover from orcs. They also have extremely fortified strongholds and are good at mining. What's kind of interesting is, because of these traits, hobgoblins are sort of the dwarves of goblinkin, which is funny. Other than them not being short, of course, they have the rest of the hallmarks. Oh, they also way more violent, but strangely, they really respect dwarves, which is a courtesy I don't think the dwarves will return to them. I'm not going to get into the weirdness behind it, but hobgoblins were both playable as characters in original D&D and 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. Remember, original D&D is not the same as 1st edition D&D. Also, I know somebody in the comment section is going to complain about it if I don't bring it up, but originally hobgoblins were kind of Asian. In some art they had slantish eyes and had the Chinese-inspired armor like I mentioned above, but it became much more neutral and like a hodgepodge armor set as we get further on. That's one of the reasons, by the way, I'm convinced that they're related to the Tengu, even though this develops on its own further on. I do want to point out, though, for those of you who are going to think about this in the future, I'm 99% sure this is why Warhammer Fantasy has them as Mongolians, and why Elder Scrolls Orcs are also vaguely Asian-inspired with their armor aesthetic. But these hobgoblins are much more lawful in the fact that they're the only race considered lawful evil from the Goblin group in Dungeons & Dragons. There's actually a little bit more cool lore that gets added to them I want to talk about. The first thing is the personal perimeter. This is a concept that hobgoblins have, that you're responsible for yourself and the immediate area around you. This is why they fight in Legionnaire-style formations, and how they are so order-focused in such a group like the Goblins. Different editions also flop back and forth on if hobgoblins are the true creators of goblins or not. I kind of like this idea, the idea that hobgoblins had an empire so vast and powerful it allowed them to do genetic experimentation, and through these experiments they created the goblins to be infiltrators and scouts, and then wanted the bugbears to be laborers and elite soldiers. By the way, I hate bugbears. I think it's an absolutely terrible name and a lame creature. If you want me to cover them, you guys have to get like 1,000 likes to this video and have a bunch of comments begging for it. Otherwise, I'm never going to do them. I just don't like them. So, back to hobgoblins. The only other cool change about hobgoblins is they become strangely okay with other religions. Basically, when they conquer an area, they allow the people to keep their deities. However, if it's a war god, they remove them, because that's competition to their god. But otherwise, you are free to worship whoever you want, as long as you pay taxes to them. Which is funny, because this actually mirrors how the ancient Romans would do this as well, and I'm fond of this connection. This is a more unique way to take an evil creature and make them stand out differently from other ones. Now, from here, unfortunately, hobgoblins kind of stay stuck in Dungeons & Dragons. They're only really brought over out of obligation to other fantasy properties that copy D&D. That's what happened to things like Warhammer Fantasy, where they tossed the hobgoblins in Mongolia and gave them the nomad warrior aesthetic. The title of the leader is funny though. It's Hobgoblicon, which is just great. Something else is really interesting about Warhammer is these hobgoblins have actually evolved from regular goblins, but they got bony protrusions on their back. This is something that evolved evolutionarily, because hobgoblins were so frequently backstabbing each other that having an armor plate there was necessary for survival. They're just meaner and crueler and more evil than regular goblins, which I think is great, but they're pretty much lacking due to how far away they are from the central narrative lands of Warhammer Fantasy. Another funny thing, though, is their former leader, Kengai Khan, was the first hobgoblin to ever die of old age. Another cool example I want to cite, though, is World of Warcraft with Hobgoblins. They're not the only ones I've seen do this, but I'm going to point to them as this because I think it's the most popular property that does this. Hobgoblins are mutated versions of regular goblins. They are much bigger and way more powerful. What's unique about theirs, though, is that they're a result of alchemical experimentation instead of the typical magic experimentation. They're a lot stupider and bigger and tougher than regular goblins. This kind of works well, and it kind of functions as ogres in other settings, which is cool, but it's not my cup of tea, to be honest. The third way I actually see hobgoblins is something I call the unnamed one, where a setting basically has D&D as hobgoblins, they just don't call them that. The Elder Scrolls is a good example that I want to point to. In the province of Hammerfell, which is the big desert for the Alakir, there used to be a society of big goblins. They came through a portal and started attacking people. They were the size of a man, while also being much more martially focused. This is just a hobgoblin. They don't call them that, but it's really what it was. I do think this is probably related back to the day when the Elder Scrolls was more of a tabletop setting, and they wanted to port over hobgoblins, but they just never made them into the full release. In a surprising twist, by the way, I want to talk about Gary Gygax's hobgoblins. You might be incredibly confused right now because isn't that the entire first part of this video? Well, yes, but you see, Gary actually left TSR and lost the right to work on Dungeons & Dragons after a few years. He took some time off and bounced between several different games and ideas until he eventually started working on a setting called Legendary Adventures. By the way, I hate the spelling on this. I know what he's going for, I don't like it. Now, there's a tabletop of the same name to go with that, and it's got a lot of the ideas he was working on at the time, remixed though through modern cultures and ideas of fantasy, or at least what he wrote on it. In this, he has his own version of goblins, which are 5 feet tall and are mean, angry, tough jerks. They then bully the smaller race called hobgoblins. You see, this time, Gary learned a lot more about the origins of hobgoblins and how they were originally smaller than regular goblins, and he wanted to include that in his setting. There isn't much more about the setting out there, as it was not very popular and it came out in the late 90s, early 2000s. It is sort of lost. If there's a big uproar in demand, I might do a big deep dive, but judging by its size, I don't think either would be worth it at this stage. So now that I've talked about hobgoblins throughout the years, I want to talk about how they are in my setting of Enos. I'm going to have to do a bit of a big lore dump first to get you up to speed. About 2,000 years ago, there were several nations of gnomes and, at that time, regular goblins. They eventually had a massive war between each other that lasted hundreds of years and kept both people ground to the bone. The gnomes eventually allied with the Minotaurs and managed to keep their islands safe when the goblins were laying siege to the last Nova strongholds on the mainland. Both sides were very desperate for victory, and somebody made a terrible choice. It's unknown which side did it, but one of them opened up a massive portal straight into hell. Then demons started pouring forth and slaughtering both sides. The gnomes managed to survive better since they had their islands they could retreat to, but the goblins were nearly wiped out. The majority of them fled west into the Dwarvish lands, where they sought refuge. However, a large contingent managed to steal some of the gnomish boats and attempted to sail east, out into the Great Blue Ocean. The ones that stayed behind were nearly massacred by the dwarves, only for the intervention of the gods to save them. These original goblins were given shadowy forms and the ability to blend into things. That's kind of why there's rumors that goblins spontaneously show up in cities. Even with all the dark alleys, there's always enough shadows for them to be born. At least, according to the locals at the tavern. The truth is that the goblins are just the best at hiding now and can manipulate shadows to their advantage, but they lost a lot of their height and prowess at the time. Not the ones that sailed east, though. They still suffered immensely, but managed to luckily stumble across a handful of islands for supplies. Each time they would land, strip the island bare, and then move on, with barely enough to get to the next few islands, none of them being large enough for the people to settle on. Although their bellies were constantly hungry, they eventually ran out of livestock, enough of them to keep killing anyway, and then they realized, hey, if we keep the cows and chickens alive for milk and eggs, it'll provide us with more food in the long term than slaughtering them. Also, these guys can eat the grasses on the islands that we land on, meaning that we can produce more off of less. So, After sailing for an uncounted number of years, they eventually saw great black smoke in the distance. Although scholars doubt how long they sailed for, what is known is where they ended up. The island of Caldera. Well, I say island, but this place is more like a continent. That is where they met the Anakate people. I will cover the Anakate people at a much later date. But these eastern sailing goblins, or Hobgoblins, landed on some of the outlying islands of the coast of the new continent. Having struggled through so much hardship and understanding the importance of discipline, this comes from their ideas of being a sailor society for so long. You have to be strict on a boat or everybody drowns. They also became very close-knit and worked together to build up their communities. Like I said, during sailing they realized the benefits of keeping their fellow animals alive. Then after becoming master fishermen, they became mostly vegetarian as a society. Their time at sea also changed their bodies. Perhaps it was natural selection, or perhaps it was the same magic that altered their cousins to become some acquainted with the shadows. Either way, they grew taller to see over their ships easier, grew hair to help them stay warm in the ocean, and their faces were burned and turned to a mix of reds and browns and oranges. In the new lands that they found themselves in, there was plenty of exotic plants for them to eat and enjoy, as well as colorful dyes for their clothing. They began dressing in vibrant colors and entered into several tense negotiations with the Anakate, whose lands they now clung to. They adopted a strict policy of self-defense. They would not outwardly harm creatures. However, if you were to attack them, they would make sure that the returning strike was devastating. As such, it became culturally important to carry weapons around at all times, and they also make sure they are fair in their dealings with neutral parties to not spark further conflicts and risk their race. Eventually, they were reintegrated into the wider world after the discovery of the New World 260 years ago, and the sealing of the Demon Portal 250 years ago led to a new age. Slowly, Hobgoblin adventurers and explorers started making their way across the world, with some even returning to their original homeland to create a colony with their shorter goblin cousins. So yeah, I just wanted to take a lot of the martial aspects and the strictness that you get from modern Hobgoblins, while adding in a nice nod back to the desire for dairy and milk that we saw in the original stories. So how do Hobgoblins exist in your settings, and did I miss any major works or worlds with Hobgoblin stories? That is all for today. Thank you for watching this far. If you enjoyed the content, I'd appreciate if you liked and subscribed. I'm looking forward to your candor in the comments below, and have a great day.